Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the host alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida or Department of Sociology.
Hi everyone, this is Marina.
And I'm Halley.
And today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about our stories. Well, specifically Halley's story. And we, of course, by now you have seen our first episode where we introduce ourselves and our goals for the podcast. But today we're going to give a bit more detail about Halley's story. So let's get started. So the first question, the easy question, where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in Burlington, Vermont. Shout out to Bernie. That's where he was the governor for a while. And I grew up there for a while, but I spent most of my adolescence in a very conservative suburb of Baltimore, Maryland, which will become a big part of this when I discuss it further.
Yes. Okay, so growing up in Baltimore, how would you describe your childhood?
My mom would describe me as a very stubborn child also. So as I said in the previous episode, I had a pretty normal childhood, besides the fact that my family, they're Holocaust survivors. So at a very young age, I was basically learning the story of my grandpa and how he survived the Holocaust. And I learned at an age that was very young, probably too young for a kid to know what genocide is, and learning about truly what oppression is at a super young age. And I think hearing that at such a early point in my life subconsciously solidified a lot of my values in me without me realizing, and that only really came to fruition later in my life, near my high school years and into my college years.
So then, how would you describe your high school years?
They were interesting. I feel like mostly what I experienced was what I might describe as microaggressions about being Jewish. Because I lived in a very conservative area for a while, I just kind of became known as the one Jewish girl. And I was around a lot of people who were Christian and went to church often, and a lot of my friends went to church. And so I just ended up going to church activities because that's what my friends would do. And whenever I'd go there, my mom would be don't tell your grandmother you're going to church right now. She's hearing this for the first time now. She's listening. Hi, Grandma. But so it was a lot of confusion between my Jewish part of me and then also trying to balance that with getting along with friends and being able to hang out and finding an identity within a conservative area.
Right. So before we get into more detail about what that has been like, I did want to talk about a little bit more about your grandpa's story. Mm-hmm. So what would you like to share with us?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting story that might take a little time to dig through, but I'll try to make it so it's quite understandable to everyone. Mm-hmm. So my grandpa's name was Ziggy, and he had a twin brother named Benno, and they were about 12 years old when the Third Reich started taking power. And they also had a younger sister named Margot, and their mother's name was Hannah. And so they're going to be the big actors in this story. But basically, they lived in Antwerp, Belgium. And one day, his father, like most people, his father went to work, and then they just never really saw him again. And for a long time, they didn't know what happened to their father. But near the middle of World War II, a man came to their door from the resistance, and he basically said that they are hiding Jewish children from the Nazis, and they offered to take my grandpa and his two siblings. And so my Margot, his sister, refused to go. He said that she didn't want to go without her mom, and that it didn't matter if it was safety, is that she wanted to be with her mom because that's where she felt most safe. So she decided to stay at home with her mom, and Ziggy and Benno decided to go with the man and with the resistance and be hidden. So basically, they were taken to a Catholic orphanage within a church, and they were given the names of past orphans and basically given new identities. So my grandpa went by Jake and my grandpa's brother went by Just. And those were the two names that they kind of had for the next 3 years. And the priest named Father Tuberculi, he was the one who was kind of in charge of this whole thing of hiding them. They were kept in the church and they started working as altar boys as a way to kind of hide their Jewish identity. And Father Tuberculi was really, really interesting because my grandma tells a story that at one point there was another priest that came and visited the church. And as a gift, they gave all the altar boys Catholic Bibles. And after that priest left, Father Tuberculi went up to them and took the Bibles back from them and basically said, like, I don't want you reading this because once you leave here, you are going to go back to being Jewish. And I don't want this to be a conversion for you. Like, I want you to stay true to your Jewish roots. And I don't want you to feel like you have to be converted to Catholicism by reading this. So like, he just wanted to make sure that they remembered their Jewish roots and like why they were there and what like they were so connected to when they got there. So it's really interesting hearing that even as they were hidden, Father Tuberculi really, really wanted them to like stay true to themselves and remember that they shouldn't be afraid to be Jewish and continue practicing Judaism now and like for the rest of their lives. So that was extremely interesting. Father Tuberculi started to think that there was questions around him maybe being part of like the underground resistance. And at some point, soldiers had to come and stay at their church because they needed more places to sleep. And Father Tuberculi knew that they were twins and that might look suspicious. And like at the time there were like there's research going on twin Jewish children. So what ended up happening is my grandpa and his brother were separated and my grandpa's brother was sent to a different parish. And they were basically separated until they were finally freed years later. So they were there from about like early 1943 to near like the end of 1945, where they were finally reunited at the end of that time period. And so while this was happening, so that's the story of my grandpa that was going on from those years of 1943 and 1945. So cut back to Margot and Hannah, my grandpa's sister and his mother. And so at some point after my grandpa was hidden, soldiers came to the door and basically like threw them into a train like cattle and they were sent off somewhere. And when the doors opened, Margot and Hannah found themselves at Auschwitz Concentration Camp, which is probably like one of the most well-known concentration camps that has some of the most like meticulous recordings of what happened there. And we learned about this in school, and I feel like everyone might kind of know what goes on at concentration camps, but it was like absolutely brutal to them. And the first thing that happened when they got off the train was that they were filed, they took their information, they were kind of stripped, and they shaved their heads. And so Margot, my grandpa's sister, apparently once her head was shaved, it was like downhill from there. Like she could not like possibly even think to survive in this place. And her morale was just like completely broken down immediately. And that was a way to dehumanize them. Like basically they're thrown in this train like cattle. They were sent to this place, they're herded off and they were stripped and they were just taken, all their humanity was taken away from them. And that really, really affected her. And this is stuff that that Hannah, my grandpa's mom, kind of talked about afterwards, but later in life, she didn't really like talking about this experience very much. And like, she had like the tattoo of her number on her body and it was something that she kept very hidden and very personal. So like the stories I know about my grandpa's mom are very minimal. But basically, at some point, Margot was 16 at this point. So it's weird when I heard this whole story and knowing this in my head when I was the age of 16, thinking about what I would be like at the age of 16 in a concentration camp going through the same stuff. It's like mind blowing to put yourself in that mindset. Even like, it's weird now as like a 23-year-old or when you're like 40 or 50, but thinking about what you were like at the age of 16, like that's even more insane. And so one day the soldiers came and they took the children to go clean up. And I think we all know what that kind of means, but basically Margot was taken to a gas chamber, and that was the last time that her mother ever saw her. And so Hannah went into the concentration camp with her daughter and basically left without her. And that was really, really hard for her to go through. And Hannah spent 2 years as a prisoner of Auschwitz. And once she was finally released, she was taken to a hospital because she was just completely emaciated. It was just like her bones. Like, she had not eaten. She was just doing basically manual labor this whole time. And she grew up as kind of like a poor woman anyways, who was like, did some manual labor in her life beforehand. So I feel like she was just kind of like a strong woman to begin with. But anyone who is strong could go into a concentration camp and not be able to survive. Like, it's not something where if you're just strong, you can survive a concentration camp. That's not how it works. But she was lucky enough to have survived and gotten out the other end. But basically, she was sent to a hospital where she started yelling the name Father Tuberculi because she knew that was the name of the priest that took her children into hiding. And so she was yelling for Father Tuberculi, and she was like, I need this father. And people are like, this woman's insane. Why is a Jewish woman calling for a Catholic priest? Like, there must be something wrong with her. And they sent her to a mental institution in Switzerland. And so she spent her next amount of time in a mental hospital yelling for Father Tuberculi, saying that he has her children. And so she was basically sent to a mental institution because she was calling the name of a Catholic priest, which I get sounds crazy. Why is a Jewish woman calling the name of a Catholic priest? But while she was at the mental institution, she was talking with one of the workers in Flemish, and she still persistently was calling this father's name. And he actually recognized the name of the priest and was able to get in contact with him. And so basically, the worker got in contact with Father Tuberculi, told them where the children were, and then he told my great-grandma, where they were. And basically, after she was released from the mental institution, it took her about 2 to 3 more years to finally actually see her kids again. So it was the whole time of her in Auschwitz and them being separated. And then after she was finally freed, it still took them 2 to 3 years for them to finally get in contact again. And that's basically because once my grandpa and his brother were freed, they went back to Antwerp, just like where their home was, hoping to find their family and hoping to find people there. And what happened was someone kind of took them under their wing. It was someone who worked during the war and kind of knew them beforehand. And so basically this older man was making sure that they had food to eat, there was a roof over their head, basically just taking care of them while they're sorting things out. He gave them cigarettes to sell on the street so they could start making money for themselves. And this man asked my grandpa, do you have any relatives in the US? And my grandpa was like, I think I have a cousin. And so this man in the US newspaper said, the twin Hudis brothers are looking for family in the US. Please contact if you are related to them. And I guess their cousins read it. Oh, it was a Jewish newspaper. It was a newspaper specifically for Jewish people in the US. And I think that's why they were able to find it. And so they read the newspaper, saw that they were talking about my grandpa and his brother, and basically were like, yeah, you can come stay with us. And so my grandpa and his brother then went to the US to stay with them for a while. Meanwhile, when my great-grandma was freed from the institution, there was now a quota for people from Poland to get into the US. So she could not get to the US right away and basically just had to wait until there was more of a quota open, and then she could finally immigrate to the US, which is why it took so long for them to finally reunite later down the line. Mm-hmm. So that's basically, I might have missed parts. It's kind of a long story, I'm sorry. Yeah. But that's basically the version of my grandpa's story and his mother's story that I know the best. So yeah.
Yeah. So after listening to those stories.
I forgot a point. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Another interesting point about this is that my grandpa and my great-grandmother didn't really know what happened so like my grandpa didn't really know what happened to his dad. Basically, he left and then they never saw him again. And later they found out that he, before 1944-ish, was also taken as a prisoner of Auschwitz. And he was also killed there. And so they found this out because Auschwitz and just like the Third Reich and the Nazis kept like really meticulous records about like everyone that they put in concentration camps, everyone that died, the day they got to the concentration camps, the day they died, all of their personal information. And then that information later was then used by a lot of families to find out what happened to the people they knew and loved. And so it's crazy to think that my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather were both prisoner of Auschwitz at different times, and that he unfortunately died before she could get there, and Margot also died there. It's just like sad to think that my family's history is tied up in this one really, really awful place. And a lot of families are, which is really sad to think about the amount of people that were lost and the amount of family lines that were just like completely decimated because of this one awful place. So it's really interesting how they kept records of like absolutely everything, which then also was their downfall. So it's really interesting how they did it.
Yeah. And I was going to say, before we move on to the rest of the conversation, I was going to say, like, when it comes to this topic specifically, I think that people in the US are desensitized to it. Yeah. And it's just really important to, I mean, you're 23 and you know all of these stories, so, you know, to such detail, and it still lives with you, and that still affects your daily life. And it will continue to affect your life for the rest of your life.
Right.
So I think that is just really important to really contextualize when we talk about just the experience of Jewish people. And when we talk about it today, we, especially as young people, we need to realize that it is still relevant. It's not just some, you know, just history, just stories. It's still something that affects people to this day, and people of our age. So
right. Yeah, and that's something I'll definitely go and talk about more when further in the interview. But it's like you know, my grandpa passed away when I was about 10, and so I heard all these stories, and like I internalized them, but like I was too young to like truly analyze them and like formulate the questions that I do have now. And so it's interesting, like in high school, we had to read the book Night by Elie Wiesel. And that was basically, yeah. I'm actually super glad they make people read that, because it goes into a lot more detail of what happened and a lot more gruesome detail. But when I was reading that, I was like, oh, this is what like my great grandmother went through. Like she was a prisoner at Auschwitz, one of like the most well-known concentration camps that's like highly documented. Like this is what she went through. And that was really strange for me to sit there in a room with just like a bunch of like asshole teenagers and like hearing this story. And then I was sitting there having like these existential crises about like, this is what my family went through. And then like the first time we were told we were reading Night by Elie Wiesel and it's about the Holocaust and like Jewish persecution, everyone was like, and just like turned around to me in class and like looked at me, and I just was like,
of course,
like, okay. But it's like it's very interesting as I get older and as I can start to like reconcile with all these stories that I hear, how truly like I don't know, insane it was that this happened in general. And this happens unfortunately all the time in the world, but like the fact that it happened to my family. And I think I also desensitized myself to it to an extent, because one, I've heard these stories so often that it's kind of just like I'm just like rephrasing what I've already said. And so it's just like, oh, this like crazy thing happened to my family, lol. Like, but like that's not actually what it is. And so I have to remind myself that this is a lot more intense than even I give it credit for. And that's like, even as I was telling the story, I feel like I was almost just like line by line, like rephrasing everything that I had heard without really like super emotional detail, just because like, I don't know, I've kind of taken that part away, because if I get too emotional about it, it can be a lot to take at once. And so it's more of like a detachment from it as like a coping mechanism, I guess. Because it's just like taking the time to think about that is just really intense. And so it's like it's sometimes like something easier to just like forget that happened. And I'm someone who is a Holocaust, or like granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And I sometimes just like forget it happened. So I can only imagine what someone who is like so far removed from this would also possibly think about, just like not just taking a moment to think it or remember it at all. And I get it. It's a lot. So it's strange. It's very nuanced.
Yeah. So, and this is why we're having the conversation right now. This is why we're sharing the story.
Yeah, that kind of turned into a therapy session for a second. That was weird.
That's what we are here for. So, so then, going back to now, moving to more your Jewish roots, and so knowing that you've heard these stories for so long and know them by heart. So, in terms of your Jewish roots, how connected do you feel to them, and is there anything that makes you especially feel connected to it?
Yeah, so I usually consider myself Jew-ish, which is like what I tell everyone. It always gets a laugh because every time, but it's basically my way of saying that like I don't identify that strongly as a Jewish woman. However, I feel extremely connected to Judaism through my family roots and basically through my grandpa's story. And it almost feels like wrong in some way, or like it feels like a shame to like know these stories and know what happened to Jewish people just because they practice Judaism. And then I get to a point in my life where I just kind of abandon Judaism altogether, and it just kind of feels like a shame. Like I still want to treasure it in a way it's important to people and it was important to my family's past. But I didn't really get get a chance to ask him all these questions. So I guess my connection really comes through slowly learning about it over time and learning about the Holocaust and my family's story and what people went through. And then basically my connection to the Holocaust being kind of a bridge to what I do today. And it's less about the faith and more about what I've learned from my family's experience with Judaism and my experience with Judaism myself.
Right. So then in terms of the faith, and we do want to make a distinction between being Jewish by ethnicity and also being practicing Judaism. So we do want to make that distinction. So now talking about Judaism itself as a faith that your family held and still holds, right?
Yeah.
So how did their experience and through the Holocaust and all these traumatic things, how did that influence their connection to the faith, or did it influence it in any way?
Right. So basically, I found that after my grandpa's experience, he became stronger in his faith and stronger in Judaism after he was freed. And he basically continued to go to synagogue and practice Judaism until like the day he passed. And so I found that I've been told that basically people who went through the Holocaust either become completely solidified in their Judaism or they kind of abandon it completely. And there's not much in the middle of that. And I mean, I can kind of understand that. And I think maybe it's because of Father Tuberculi, like making sure that he stayed so close to his Jewish roots while he was hidden, that he kept that connection throughout his life. And I have a complicated relationship with Judaism and like religion in general, just because I grew up seeing religion as a reason why a bunch of people were killed. And I was like, is this a big enough reason for 6 million Jewish people to be killed? The fact that our religion was different. And so because of that, I was like, to me, I was like, I don't want to have to deal with something that held that heavy of a consequence. And I just kind of like felt icky about it.
Yeah.
But whenever, not with like, I didn't feel icky about Judaism itself, but just like being connected to a religion, I should say. I should clarify that. It was just that I would just rather not, I just didn't really want to hold a religion after knowing all of that. And so how I kind of defined my faith with Judaism is tied into another story, which I will quickly share. And when people ask me about my faith to Judaism, I use this phrase that I learned through this story. So basically, in high school, I took German, which not a great, I should have taken Spanish. It would have been a lot more helpful for me in the long run. I should have taken Spanish. But my family spoke German. My brother took German. Like, I thought German would be helpful for me just to like communicate with my family and whatnot. But every year there was something called German Day. And so all the German clubs around the county got to go to the local college. And basically, there were a bunch of activities that were put on for us. And one of the things that happened was there was a Holocaust survivor that came. And he basically spoke about his experience being a Holocaust survivor in Germany. And he told his whole story. And at the end, there was a point for questions. And a bunch of people were going up and asking him stuff. And I really wanted to ask him a question, but I was so nervous. I was super nervous. And my friend was like, just do it, go ask him. And so I got up in line. I didn't know whether to say that I was Jewish or that I was a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And so I didn't. And that's very important. I did not say any of that. And so I got up there and I asked him something that I would have asked my grandpa if he was still alive. And this was a question because my feelings with religion was so complicated at the time. This was something I really needed clarification on, especially from a Holocaust survivor, since I couldn't ask my grandpa. And I basically asked him, I said, how has your experience with the Holocaust affected your faith? Do you feel like it's stronger? Do you feel like it's weaker? And how do you feel about religion moving forward? And he basically said, after his experience in the Holocaust, he considers himself Jewish culturally and ethnically, but no longer identifies with it as a religion or just identifies with any religion, basically. And so that's now the answer that I usually give to people because that resonated with me a lot. But the most surprising thing that happened is after I asked him the question and he answered, he looked at me and he hugged me like hard and like for a bit of time. And that was crazy to me because he hugged no one before that asked questions. And I did not say that I was Jewish. And I did not say I was a granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And I was like, what was this? And so I like walked off the stage. I was like getting like kind of teary eyed. I sat down and my friend was like, what just happened? He just treated you like completely different than like anyone else who just came on stage. And he was just like so nice to me. And if I ever believed in a higher power that was stronger, that like it was just like so intense. I was like, how did he know? Why did he treat me differently than other people? And like it felt like he knew on like a deeper level. I understood what he went through and that like I had some sort of family history with this. And that was just a huge moment. Just the fact that I got to talk to a Holocaust survivor and ask a question that I would have loved to ask my grandpa. And then hearing an answer that resonated with me so much, and then feeling just like a super strong personal connection to this guy when he didn't really know anything about me was super intense. And so my faith, not super strong religious wise, but I still identify with Judaism very strongly in a cultural sense.
Got it. Well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And so now moving on to so of course, now we've talked about your family's experiences as Jewish people, specifically your grandparents. But so now in the modern, in the present world, how has your identity or your family's identity as Jewish people, how has that shaped your experience in the world?
Like I said earlier, growing up in a conservative part of Maryland and being like one of the only Jewish people, it added some things that I didn't really expect. Like I talked about the church experience and it like I was just kind of known as the Jewish girl. And in high school, I ran for treasurer on the exec board. And it just kind of became an ongoing joke, like, oh, of course the Jewish girl ran for treasurer. Like, of course she would. Of course the Jew would run for treasurer to control the money for the school. Like, it was that, like, ongoing Jewish sentiment that everyone always makes jokes about all the time.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I ended up winning the race. I was treasurer, so I don't know what that means. anti-Semitism is wrong, but I also won treasure. But anyways, it was like it was just like a lot of like microaggressions like that. And like there was a friend that I sat next to in a lot of my classes who, when discussing things that like bothered him or annoyed him, he'd be like, oh, he's such a Jew. Oh, that person's such a Jew. And then he would turn to me and he'd be like, oh, not like that, Halley. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're fine, right? And would just kind of like, he would recognize what he was saying was wrong by like saying, oh, this blank bad thing or person is a Jew when they weren't. And recognize that like it was enough to be offensive, but not enough to stop saying it. And it's something that happened many times while I knew him. So it's not like one time he said it, and then I was like, oh, sorry, Halley. It was like he said it, and then every single time after that, he continuously said it and still turned around and made that sort of remark to me, but it continued to happen nonetheless. And that was someone I considered a friend. So it was weird to kind of just like sit there and kind of just have to take it. And I call those microaggressions, and maybe I should call it just like anti-Semitism, but I'm not sure how I categorize that in my head, because like as someone whose family went through the Holocaust, like the most intense form of anti-Semitism possible, like it seems like anything less, like anything more minor than that, I don't really know. Like it almost in my head doesn't feel fair to call it anti-Semitism, even though it probably truly is. I just haven't reconciled in my head that what I faced was anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism exists outside of super violent and murderous or like crazy. Like anti-Semitism can come in many forms. It doesn't just have to be the Holocaust. It doesn't have to be murder. It doesn't have to be genocide. It also comes in these comments and just like small things that people say and people might think without realizing about Jewish people. And so those were weird forms of, I guess, anti-Semitism. And one thing I got a lot when I told people I was Jewish was like, oh, you don't look like you're Jewish. Or like, oh, you don't look like a Jew. And I'm like, okay, explain to me what a Jewish person looks like. Like, if I made you list the characteristics of a Jewish person, you would then feel stupid that you said that comment, because it's also just like a lot of stereotypes that were created about Jewish people that were a part of propaganda during Nazi Germany to make them like, oh, like the big nose, like the messy curly hair, like it was all like that was all used as propaganda against Jewish people. So like telling someone like, oh, you don't look like a Jewish person is like, do you know what that means? Do you know quite what that means when you like say that type of stuff? And so it's just like those little things that I experienced growing up, especially in a conservative part of Maryland.
Right. And I, of course, I mean, I don't have that. I am not Jewish. I don't have that experience, of course, but I do. Going back to, I like the example that you gave and the way that you explained it. And I think obviously a lot of people are going to have different views on anti-Semitism and what is and what it is, what it's not. But I think the main point is that the propaganda and all that, those stereotypes, the people that use them again as jokes or as just talking about somebody in an offensive way, they knew enough to use that.
Right.
They knew enough to use those words, and it speaks to the privilege that at that time, you know, you're privileged enough to make the joke because you never went through that and your family never went through that, and you still remain privileged enough to get away with the joke.
Right, exactly.
Because America saved us from the Holocaust, so, you know.
Exactly.
So we can't be anti-Semitic. So yeah.
Exactly.
Those are my quick thoughts on that. But
and I mean, he's also surrounded by a room of white Christians, so it's not like anyone else was going to call him out of it.
Nobody was going to speak up.
Yeah, as the one like little Jewish girl, I was going to be like, hey, you better stop that. And like, no one's going to listen to me. Everyone's just going to think I was dumb. I mean, I should have said something, but I was young at the time and like didn't quite understand what was happening. And so like looking back in it, I'm like, wow, like that's kind of just like a crappy situation to be stuck in, where you don't know whether you can speak out for yourself or not.
Yes. Yeah. And before we move on to the next question, which is related, I think it's also important to note that this is still happening today. these jokes, these stereotypes, they're still going around today in 2022. So food for thought. So now to the next question. So now we've talked about a little bit about just your experience in high school and how there's a lot about your identity that shaped your interaction with others and their interactions, the way that they viewed you and the way that they treated you. So now when it comes to your family's history and taking all of that into consideration, so how do you think your experiences shaped your own worldview or your perspectives on society and social problems?
Yeah. So I think I for a long time had a very pessimistic worldview, and I think to an extent I still do, just based off of what I've heard. But I've learned how to shape what I've learned about my family's experience and what I went through, and recognize that it is something to basically that is something I can take into my future and how I choose to promote my values. And something I mean, like, interesting about the world is that everyone loves to compare stuff to the Holocaust. Like, everything in people's mind is the new Holocaust. And I think that's really interesting to hear people say when I have like such like a nuanced understanding of the Holocaust and what happened. But I also think that when people compare things to the Holocaust, they are not focusing on the right parts. They're basically, I don't know. So in my mind, there's a quote that's very well known that I want to share because I think it's important, but it basically goes that the Holocaust did not start with Auschwitz. That's how it ended. And so when people think about the Holocaust, they think about concentration camps and they think about gas chambers and they think about mass murder, which is all true, that happened. However, there were years and years and years of a slow buildup that eventually allowed Auschwitz to happen. Auschwitz didn't just come out of nowhere. And so when people compare things to the Holocaust and they want to compare it to concentration camps, that's the wrong comparison to make. I think there are a lot of things in this world that can be compared to the very beginning of the Holocaust. And basically, it started as a group of people defining what the common enemy is. And then that group of people creating propaganda to dehumanize them, to alienate them, to basically make everyone turn against this group of people who didn't deserve it. And so it was basically removing the existence and the humanity of these people to the point where they were not viewed as fellow members of society. They weren't viewed as human anymore. They were just kind of viewed as just like disposable. And that's just a slow process. That to get to the point to view a human as disposable takes a long time, and it takes a lot of like mental scripts being created in your head. And that's basically what propaganda does. And so that people being desensitized to the violence during the Holocaust, like people are always like, oh, if I was alive during the Holocaust, I would save the Jewish people. It's like, I don't think you quite understood what like led up to it. And so a lot of people who would think that they were good people just let this stuff happen. And there were citizens that just allowed it to, they just turned a blind eye. There were soldiers who maybe didn't agree, who just wanted to stay in line. And so they accepted what was happening. And this basically was because the country created propaganda and they just found ways to make people become completely desensitized to the dehumanization of Jewish people. And I think that happens constantly with a lot of groups of people everywhere. And I think that's happened in America recently. And like basically that's our whole history of America, is basically dehumanizing certain groups of people. But especially with like the election of Trump, it's just been a lot of just like constant propaganda and dehumanization of certain groups of people that he views as unworthy. And so it's not about the connection to the Holocaust is not completely wrong. It's just misrepresented and it's misfocused. Yes. It's looking at the wrong part of history. And if people want to make comparisons to the Holocaust, they need to take their mind off like all the concentration camps, which is horrible. And they need to remember that there were years that had to lead up to that, to the dehumanization of a society, or just the desensitization of a society before it led to genocide. And I feel like that's what I fear is happening today.
Yeah, And I was going to say, I think that this is especially important, that what you mentioned about how people focus on the wrong thing. They only focus on the very last manifestation of
Right.
the Holocaust.
Mhm.
And I think that is just so relevant, especially when we take into consideration that, and I won't go into it, but there's been people recently that have been using certain inconveniences to compare them to the Holocaust. And,
Yeah.
Again, we have to go back. We have to go back in history. We have to look at the full context of how the Holocaust actually happened and why so many people were compliant with it when it happened. So that's all I'll say for now. But
yeah, I mean, you can also call the people out that try to compare themselves to the Holocaust. Like, I mean, we see it constantly with like anti-vaxxers and stuff like that right now, where it's like they think that just because they have to listen to they have to wear a mask, they're suddenly the same thing as Holocaust survivors or people who are victims of the Holocaust, which is, I don't know, crazy to me. But just like, yeah, the context, I think the biggest thing you'll learn over this podcast is that there's context to everything we talk about. Yes. And there's context to the Holocaust, and that the murder of millions of people was just the last step in a very, very, very long process that had a lot of steps. And if people don't recognize the steps while they're happening right now, that's the biggest problem. Like, people will be like, oh, you can't compare it to the Holocaust because we're not killing people in concentration camps. But it's like, you don't know what will happen unless that chain is broken, and these chains of just like dehumanization is finally broken. So like, this is a proactive effort. Like, you don't want to get to the point where you're like, oh, dang it, should have done something earlier. Like, you're supposed to be proactively stopping this stuff from happening. And we always say like, it'll never happen again. But it's like, the only way that will happen is if we recognize these patterns and stop it now. Mm-hmm. So that's important.
Yes. All right. So then on to the next question. And you already touched on this a little bit, but so you also identify as a white woman, right? Mm-hmm. So how has that, just being both a white woman but also a Jewish woman, how has that affected your experiences? And has it affected it in a unique way?
Yeah, so it's been complicated because like, obviously I'm a white woman and no one would know I was Jewish unless I said that I was Jewish, which I am now very publicly. So, but like, as a white woman, I am given many, many, many privileges. And so I think this is where the discussion of intersectionality comes in, which we will be focusing on more in episodes in the future. But basically, everyone has an intersection of different identities of themselves. So I, as a white woman, also intersect with my identity as a Jewish woman, and those intersects can create certain privileges or oppressions based on your identities. And so I've learned that like the stories I've said before, there are things that I face as a Jewish woman, but I have so many privileges as a white woman that mean that I'm given the advantage in society so much more often than I'm given the disadvantage. And so, especially because my Jewish identity can be easily concealed, it's been easy to just go about life with the privileges of just a regular Christian white woman, which is like one of the most privileged type of person you can be. And so I've learned that, like I said, how earlier I was very pessimistic for a while about my worldview, but then I realized that being privileged means that I can work with my privilege to help others that are not as privileged. And I'm not speaking for them or over them. It's just a way to amplify and the way to put myself in situations where they cannot as safely put themselves in situations. And so my identity as a Jewish person comes second to my identity as a white person. I think that's important for me to recognize that my privilege as a white woman comes way, way, way above anything that happens to me as a Jewish woman.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we also talked a little bit about this for a quick second, but so then on the side of being a Jewish woman, what, from your perspective, what do you wish people knew about being Jewish in America right now?
Yeah, so this is something we touched on, but I just wish people knew that like anti-Semitism still exists in many forms in the US and all over the world. There's a statistic that says that in 2019, the Jewish community in America experienced the highest levels of anti-Semitic hate crimes since 1979, which like people think it's the war is over, Jewish people are just like totally fine now, we're just chilling, but like that's not what's actually happening. And like just like a week ago or whenever you hear this, recently, an armed man took hostages at a synagogue in Texas. So it's like, it's an ongoing thing that I think a lot of people forget happens, but it also happens to people who outwardly identify as Jewish too. And so it's hard deciding to go to a synagogue in the US right now and deciding that you want to be open about like your Judaism because you know that you can be targeted for it. And you'd think that like it's 2022 or it was 2019, like anti-Semitism isn't a problem anymore. And I wish that was true, but it's only been going up. And I think people who have been elected into office have a lot to do with that. And I think that's affected the Jewish community a lot recently. And so it's just a reminder that it still exists in many forms, whether it be an armed gunman at a synagogue or it just be the way people talk to you in day-to-day situations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then now moving on to, this is like two questions in one, but so how does your worldview influence your goals as a sociologist? So that, and then how do you hope to contribute to social change in your career as a sociologist?
Right. So I think the answer to this question kind of goes back to a magnet that's been on my grandma's refrigerator for years. I can't remember a time where this magnet was not on her refrigerator. And it has a quote by Martin Niemöller, and he was a German in like the 1900s. And this is the quote that he said. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." And so I just think that's extremely powerful. I think it really coincides with the weird interconnection of being a white woman with privilege to a Jewish woman who has faced oppression, and that as someone with privilege, I need to make sure that I am not, that I can aid those who are fighting for their freedom and for equality or equity in America. And it takes me back to all of the people that helped my grandpa survive and all the people that really put their lives on the line. Like they could have been killed for helping my grandpa, for being part of the underground resistance. And I wish like it'd be easy to say that I just wish there would have been more people back then and they would have saved more people, but it's not that simple. It's that like it's not easy to fight against an oppressive power. And it's even harder for people who are oppressed, but it's important that people in positions of power and people who are privileged still work against those people in higher power. And so I want to make sure that I am adding, I am speaking up for, I am like helping those people that are facing the discrimination that they shouldn't be felt. The people that society have just decided don't deserve to really live. And so it's a way to just kind of like give back, almost like a way to say thanks to the people that helped my family, but a way for me to make sure that I continue that fight through with the work that I do in sociology. And that's why I'm honestly so interested in public sociology, because I don't just want to do research and read books. Like I want to do something with it the way that I hope a lot of people can do.
So then this is going to be related probably. But so the last question that I have for you today is, so if the listeners could take one thing away from your story, what would it be?
I think it would be that the intersections of our identities show that privilege can be something we need to reflect on. And I think it's easy to sit here and talk about like all the awful things that happened to my Jewish family, but I, as a white woman, basically got by as a white woman my whole life. And so it's important for everyone to reflect on their own intersections of their identity and then think about how they can aid in the efforts of people who are oppressed too. And so this is more of like, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of a call to action. I don't know, just like reflect on yourself and then think about what you can possibly do either for people in your community or people outside of your community that you want to make sure that you help and that they are treated fairly in America, because no one deserves to feel like they don't deserve a life here. And so it's really about finding how you want to give back. And I think that's most important.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to add, as a whole, that is a purpose of us sharing these stories, our personal stories, because we want to make sure that our passion and our vision for sociology, we want to make sure that we share how important our experiences are in shaping that, and how connected our lived experiences are with our journey in sociology. And I'm not saying that sociology is the only way to make social change, of course, but I think that this can be applied to any career, and any field. Any field can be used for the betterment of society. But of course, we have to reflect on just how our experiences frame those interests and how we can use them when we're whatever career we are, whatever field we're studying. How we can use them to create social change and just to apply what we know to see society progress, and also remember all these stories to, as they say, not repeat these mistakes.
Right. Yeah. And so I think sociology focuses a lot on the lived experiences of people, because not solely on the lived experience, because we were looking at the grand picture of how all society works, but it's these little stories that connect together to make the larger picture of what society is. And so, I mean, even if your story is one of privilege, that discusses what the larger meaning of society is. You don't have to have a super traumatic, dark background to recognize that your story means something to how society is formed. And we have to remember, when we are doing studies that are quantitative and look at data, especially data about people, that those data points are human lives. And so whether you're looking at like overall income in an area or just different statistics of the US society, we're not just data points. Those aren't just numbers you're looking at. Those are people's lives that are now being evaluated. And so it's important to remember what comes back to it and remembering what the context is. Because I didn't really put all this together until I was at, I was working with NextGen, which is like a political community place here. And so they basically said, like, what is your story? Like, if someone asked you, like, oh, why are you volunteering with NextGen? Why are you interested in politics? And I sat there like, oh, we'll give you 10 minutes to talk about this. And then I started writing. I was like, oh, I'm a Jewish woman. My grandpa was a Holocaust survivor. He was saved by, underground, revolutionists. And then I was like, whoa, wait, I'm also studying like these same things right now. Like it all started connecting together. And once you take the time to sit down and figure out your connections, everything starts making sense with like how you kind of want your life to progress forward. And so it was kind of just like a, oh my gosh moment, like, oh, all these years of these stories has created who I am today. And I didn't realize that until only somewhat recently. So it's definitely important to take what you know about yourself and your life story and kind of configure that into your worldview.
Yes. So thank you so much, Halley, for sharing all of that information with all of us.
Yes, thank you guys so much for listening and just like taking the time to appreciate the story.
And so for the next bonus episode, we'll be talking about my story, which is quite different. It is quite different, but we hope that you will join us for the next one. And until then, see ya.
Bye.